Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening, taking a look at our second lecture from our ethnicity chapter. Today we are looking at ethnicities in the United States. So let's go ahead and get started. So to start out, let's give some numbers so we get some context about what we're going to be talking about for the length of this lecture. So let's start out by looking at the ethnic breakdown here in the United States. Now, these statistics come from the United States Census Bureau, and that is a really reliable source. However, with that being said, these statistics come from a category called, quote, race and Hispanic origin, end quote. And so it's not ideal for ethnicity because it's not actually evaluating ethnicity. It's looking more at things like race, which again is biological ancestry, nationality, where someone is born, as well as ethnicity, the culture that someone identifies with. So that makes this a little bit trickier, but it's the most reliable source and the most reliable information we have regarding ethnicities in the United States. So that's what we're going to go with. So let's take a look at what we're talking about. These are the categories that people self-identify with the U.S. Census Bureau. And then this U.S. Census Bureau updates them with predictions and estimates throughout the course of the 10-year period in between individual census data. So here we go. White alone, not Hispanic or Latino, is 61.6% of the population. Hispanic or Latino is 17.6% of the population. So that is the second largest ethnicity in the United States and the largest ethnic minority. And so largely what we're going to be looking at today is ethnic minorities. African American, 13.3%. Asian American, 5.6%, and American Indian, 1.2%. These are the largest ethnic minorities by percentages. There are many others that are included as part of this, including two or more races. There are a lot of different ways that people can self-identify according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So to build on that, let's take a look at our first map of the evening. This map is looking at ethnicity in the United States. So as we often do, let's ask the usual questions. What type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we analyzing this? And so hopefully we looked at this and said, well, this is a choropleth map, a county scale. And this is looking at the largest ethnic group by county. Yellow is white, green is Hispanic, blue is black, red is Asian, purple is native, and then orange is Pacific Islander. So I would like to ask you guys to, what are some general observations that you guys have? Start with observations, start with questions. So I want you guys to start with that. Note some of those different things, in looking at this. What are some of the things that jump off at you? Is there anything that surprises you? Things like that. Keep in mind that this is looking at the largest ethnicity by county. So, if a county's population is not remarkably large, that could lead it leaning one way or another. So that's something that just as a thing to keep in the back of our minds, we want to be aware of. That, questions we should ask, okay, what are the populations of these counties as well? Because that's going to be important. Okay, and since most of the country is white, remember 61.6% of the United States self-identifies as being white, non-Hispanic, or Latino. Maybe it's not a surprise then that most of the counties in the United States have, at least as its largest ethnicity, the category of white. So, what happens if we change this map? What happens if we take a look at the largest ethnic minority? by county? Well, here is that map. So same kind of thing. Let's ask the usual questions. What type of map are we looking at? What scale? This is a choropleth map, county scale. But now, kind of side by side compare the last map with this map. What are some notes and observations you can make about this particular map? What are some of the trends that you notice on this map? Is there anything surprising on this map? Go ahead and write that down now. There's not a lot of information I'm going to give you on these map slides. So I want you to think like a geographer, break it down. What do you see? What do you observe? Maybe what questions come up as a result? So take a moment, jot down some of the things that you notice, some of the things that come up. Maybe anything that you have, anything that's coming up right now, I'm very interested in what you're going to get. Just as a reminder, so that you have the classes that we're looking at here. Green, again, is Hispanic. Blue is Black. Red is Asian. Purple is Native. And then orange is Pacific Islander. The next map that we have on here comes from one of the approved AP Human Geography textbooks. And this actually throws in quite a bunch of information. So it's a choropleth map. In this case, it's not as visible, but it is still county scale. Right? We should actually say subnational scale, because notice there that we also have Canada included as part of this as well. So we can see subnational groups there. And so this gives us a lot of really interesting information, because not only is this looking at things like ethnicity, it's also looking at ancestry as well. We're seeing where people are coming from. So even though we use the term, like, for example, Hispanic or Latino, notice here that our map, using a little bit more point data, it's not exactly point data, but it's a little bit closer to that. With the letters, we can see where different groups of people are coming from. So we can see that the light purple of the Southwest is Hispanic, but more specifically, it's mainly Mexican. A little bit of Spanish. You can see in the southern part of Florida there, Cuban. And so we can see a little bit of that. Again, what I'd like you to do on this slide is notes, observations, questions, trends, anything that you notice with regards to this. So take a moment, maybe press pause on the video. What do you notice? What do you observe? What questions do you have? Come up with something. And there's a little Dora for you. So what did you come up with? Jot those down. I'm very interested. We're going to be discussing that in class. So let's start to take a look at some of our ethnic minorities here in the United States, beginning with our largest ethnic minority, and that is Hispanic and Latino. Remember that 17.6% of the U.S. population self-identifies as being Hispanic or Latino. So keep that in mind, 17.6%, okay? So I want you to start out just notes, observations. What do you see? What do you observe regarding the spatial distribution of Hispanic Americans? It could be regions of the country. It could be states. How would you describe the spatial distribution of Hispanic Americans in the United States using this choropleth county scale map of the U.S.? First off, start jotting down what you observe already, and then we're going to give some very detailed information regarding this. You don't need to have all of this written down, but maybe a couple, especially prominent facts that kind of jump out to you, maybe not a bad idea to have. Okay, so using that U.S. Census Bureau data, we can give some very specific details about the distribution of ethnicities in the United States. So, beginning with Hispanic and Latinos, we could describe it as being clustered in the Southwest. And we have some data to support that. Okay, remember, 17.6% of the country self-identifies as Hispanic or Latino, but the U.S. Census Bureau breaks that down by state as well, so we can compare the national average versus state averages. Okay, so California, for example, 37.6% of the population of California self-identifies as Hispanic or Latino. Arizona, 29.6%. Nevada, 26.5%. Over a quarter of the population of the state of Nevada self-identifies as Hispanic or Latino. New Mexico, 46.3%, almost half. Texas, 37.6%. Okay. Now, in addition to that, we can also give some statistics about other states with very large Hispanic populations. 87% of the total Hispanic population is clustered in just 4 states. Just 4 states. If you're really so inclined, maybe press pause right now. Give your prediction of what 4 states you think those will be. This is a good practice to get into as we're getting closer to the AP exam. Start thinking, okay, where do I think this is going to be? Why is it going to be there? So, if you're looking for a little extra challenge, try and predict it before I give it to you. All right? 87% of the Hispanic population in the United States found in just 4 states. Those states are California with 33% of the U.S. Hispanic population, Texas with 20%, New York with 17%, and Florida with 17%. So in taking a look at those numbers, is there anything that kind of jumps out at you about those states? Maybe why? Maybe some of the background of those people. Where are they coming from? Things like that. Right? But overall, across the United States, about 2/3, about 66% of people who self-identify as Hispanic or Latino come from Mexico. And so that's a good statistic to know. 2/3 of all Hispanic Americans come from Mexico. So let's take a look at our next ethnic minority, and that is African American. Right? As a reminder, 13.3% of the U.S. population identifies as African American. And again, what I'm going to ask you to do, how would you describe the spatial distribution of people who self-identify as being African American? How would you describe it? Regions, states, things like that. How would you describe it? Go ahead and do that right now. And once again, we'll give some statistics. We can say that largely both in looking at the map as well as with statistics, African Americans are largely clustered in the southeast. So here's some numbers. Remember, 13.3% of the U.S. population self-identifies as African American. Here are some of the numbers from the southeast. Alabama, 26.8%, over a quarter of the population. Georgia, 31.5%. Louisiana, 32.8%. Maryland, 30.9%. South Carolina, 28.8%. Mississippi, state with the largest percentage who self-identifies as African American, 37.6%. There are some other areas that are worth noting. Washington, D.C., 52.2% of Washington, D.C.'s population self-identifies as being African American. We can also look at areas with very low African American population. In the Northeast, very few African Americans. Maine, only 1.6% of the population. New Hampshire, 1.7%. Vermont, 1.5%. In the northern border states, Montana, less than 1% of the population self-identifies as African American, 0.8%. North Dakota, 1.6%. South Dakota, 1.8%. So as much as it is useful to look at where we see how to describe where people are, it's also important to know where people may not be as well, right? And understanding that. Next ethnic minority that we're looking at here is going to be Asian American. You can note that our textbook, which is where these maps come from, again, these maps are choropleth maps, county scale. These maps come from our textbook. In this case, this particular map includes Pacific Islanders as part of this particular map when talking about Asian Americans. One of the earlier maps that we looked at did not include Pacific Islanders as being Asian. They had their own class for Pacific Islanders. So just something to be aware of, all right, in terms of ethnicity, because as far as cultural background, can be quite diverse. All right. So again, let's ask the question: how would you describe the spatial distribution of Asian Americans, including Pacific Islanders, in the United States by looking at this map? And I would probably say that it's clustered in the West. We see a much higher Asian population in the West Coast. Again, for the whole U.S. population, it's 5.6%. 5.6% of the population self-identifies as being Asian American. However, here's some of the statistics for different states. Hawaii, 57.4% of the population self-identifies as being Asian American. California, 14.9%. Now, these numbers are not quite as high as some of the other ethnic minorities that we just looked at, African American and Hispanic American. But remember, that's because Asian American isn't that large of a number here in the United States. It's only 5.6% of the national average. So California's being 14.9 is still almost 3 times as large. And so that's worth noting. Okay? Washington State, 9%. Nevada, 9%. Almost double the national average. New York, 8.2%. So above the national average. Areas where we see lower numbers of Asian Americans, the South. Mississippi, 1.1%. Alabama, 1.4%. West Virginia, less than 1%, 0.9%. All these good facts and figures to be able to come back to. Our final ethnic minority that we're going to look at in the United States is American Indians, which according to the Census Bureau also includes Alaskan Natives. So keep that in mind. American Indian and Alaskan Natives is how the U.S. Census Bureau classifies this particular category of ethnicity. Okay, and according to the U.S. Census Bureau, 1.2% of the U.S. population self-identifies as being an American Indian or Alaskan Native. So, first thing I want to ask you guys is, how would you describe the spatial distribution of American Indian and Alaskan Natives in the United States? So, taking a look at the map, how would you describe this? And it's at least worth noting that where we see large numbers of American Indian and Alaskan Natives, we also see the reservation system that has been put in place by the U.S. government over the course of U.S. history. All right, we see reservations in the Four Corners region out west: Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. We see reservations in Oklahoma. We see reservations in the Dakotas. There's reservations in North Carolina, if you notice that small pocket there. So make that connection that, where we see larger numbers of American Indian and Alaska Natives, we also see largely the reservation system having been put in place. Okay. So again, let's give some numbers so we have some context to this. Again, 1.2% of the U.S. population self-identifies as being an American Indian or Alaska Native. So let's take a look at some of the states with the largest populations. California, 13.9% of California's population self-identifies as being an American Indian or Alaska Native. Oklahoma, 9.2%. Arizona, 6.8%. Texas, 6%. New York State, 4.2%. And in fact, a majority of all American Indian and Alaska Natives are found in just 10 states. And again, if you're looking for a bit of a challenge, press pause right now. See if you can predict all 10 states where a majority, more than 50%, of all American Indian and Alaska Natives are found. Right? So if you're looking for that challenge, press pause right now. Give your predictions. All right. But here are the top 10. Right. With more than 50% of the U.S.'s American Indian and Alaska Natives. California, Oklahoma, Arizona, Texas, New York are the same 5 that we just listed above, with large percentages of the state population self-identifying. Okay. New Mexico, part of the Four Corners. Washington State, North Carolina, Florida, and Michigan. Any states that maybe jump off at you as being somewhat surprising for not having been part of that list of American Indians and Alaska Natives? California, Oklahoma, Arizona, Texas, New York, New Mexico, Washington, North Carolina, Florida, and Michigan constitute a majority of the U.S. population of American Indian and Alaska Natives. So, jot down your notes, thoughts, observations, things like that. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk a bit about another spatial distribution that is important to understand for this. And this is something that we're going to come back to later on in the year as well. In addition to just regions of the countries and states where we see large numbers of ethnic minorities, it is important to understand that we also tend to see them clustered in urban areas as well. 90% of African Americans and Hispanic Americans live in big cities. All right. Contrast that with the percentage of all Americans that live in big cities, about 75%. All right. So disproportionately more African Americans and Hispanic Americans living in cities than just Americans as a whole. Okay. To give some examples of this, Detroit and New York City can be used as examples, one for each of the ethnic minorities that were mentioned above. Detroit has about 1/10, so 10% of Michigan's total population. However, the city of Detroit constitutes 50% of Michigan's African American population. So it's only 10% of the state's population, but it's 50% of the state's African American population. It's overwhelmingly clustered in the city of Detroit. New York City, similar story, but for Hispanic Americans. All right, New York City is about 25% Hispanic, whereas New York State is only about 6% Hispanic, 6.25% Hispanic. Okay, New York City is about 40% of the state's population, but 75% of the state's Hispanic population. So that means that these are just pieces of evidence to say that African Americans and Hispanic Americans tend to be clustered more in urban areas. We already mentioned Washington, D.C. as an example for African Americans earlier in the lecture. Now let's kind of look at why that might be. So let's take a look at the migration patterns, in this case for African Americans, to try and explain why this might be. Okay, and so we're going to use this as a case study to look at migration patterns, as well as a bit of economics as well to factor in this, as to why African Americans tend to be more clustered in urban areas than, say, Americans as a whole. Right? And so there's 3 major eras that we're going to look at: the forced migration from Africa, immigration to the north, and then what our textbook calls the expansion of the ghetto. We're going to look at each of those in detail. So here we go. The first event that we have to talk about is the forced migration from Africa. We've already mentioned this as part of our 8 great modern migrations. But Africans came to the United States, or what would become the United States, as part of the triangle trade. Now, a little bit of background, I mentioned this in our migration unit, but it bears repeating now. The triangle trade was a system of trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. And so from Europe to Africa, finished goods were brought from Europe to Africa, exchanged for slaves. Those slaves were then loaded on ships, brought across the Atlantic to the Western Hemisphere. Remember that from largest to smallest in terms of total numbers, it went the Caribbean, South America, and then the American South. All right. Largely, those African slaves were forced to work on plantations, harvesting raw materials, raw goods which were then often loaded back onto ships sent across the Atlantic to Europe, where they were manufactured and turned into finished goods, and the triangle trade began all again. Now, again, slavery in Africa oftentimes had no racial component to it. All right, that slavery was oftentimes a punishment for crime. It was a punishment for people who went into debt. Prisoners of war were put into slavery, but race wasn't the determining factor. However, slavery in the Americas did develop a racial component to it, which then gave rise to racism. Racism, one of our vocabulary terms from this unit, being the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And there was an element to that in American slavery, that one race was superior and one race was inferior. And that's why they were subjugated into slavery. Okay? But again, that wasn't the component behind slavery in Africa. That was something that developed in the Americas. Now, slavery remained a practice in the American South until after the Civil War, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. However, even after the abolition of slavery in the American South, many former slaves remained in the South working as sharecroppers, where they would take loans out from their former masters and work in the agricultural fields of the American South, doing what they had done their entire lives. But what ended up happening is that these sharecroppers ended up getting into massive debt and having to work for their masters for huge sums, huge periods of time, perhaps the remainder of their life, trying to pay off these massive debts for these loans that they took out after being freed from slavery. Now, there were two periods of time when there was a mass migration out of the American South to the American North. And both of these periods of time coincided with world wars, both before and after World War I and before and after World War II, largely because the manufacturing centers of the North needed workers. Okay? During a wartime economy, you're constantly producing, because these war supplies are constantly being consumed. They can't be reused, so you have to produce more and more and more. And so there was huge demand for things like cars and steel and all these other war supplies that then served as a pull factor for many African Americans out of the South. So many African Americans, for the first time, moved out of the South, largely coinciding with the periods of time before and after World Wars I and II. And so the next era of migration for African Americans was what our textbook calls the expansion of the ghetto. So as African Americans were being pulled to northern cities before and after World Wars I and II, African Americans clustered in the parts of cities where other African Americans had already settled. And this is a great example of chain migration. We pointed that out during our migration unit, that people are going to move where people of the same ethnicity or nationality had previously moved. And so what this creates are ethnic enclaves. Again, an ethnic enclave, it's one of our definitions for this chapter, a small area occupied by a distinctive minority culture. In this case, African American culture. Now, these areas where African Americans clustered in cities became known as ghettos. Again, the term ghetto we have discussed before as being associated with the part of a city where Jews live, but now it is a term that is more often used for a part of a city where people live and might be politically or economically disenfranchised or have political or economic hardships. And an example that we could use to showcase what our textbook calls the expansion of the ghetto is the city of Baltimore. Okay? In 1950, most of Baltimore's African American population lived in about a 1 square mile area. Right? Most of the population, 1 square mile in 1950. By 1970, that had expanded to a 10 square mile area. And so this was the expansion of the ghetto. Now, one of the approved human geo textbooks includes this image that we're going to pull and use to showcase the expansion of the ghetto. All right, and you'll notice that when we're talking about the expansion of the ghetto, we're talking about northern cities. So you can see the bottom part there. The early northern city is like one small part, kind of like what we said with Baltimore, 1 square mile area. Around the CBD, and this is a term that we're going to use later on in the school year very extensively, but the term CBD means Central Business District. It's the downtown area where a lot of retail, a lot of political decisions, financial decisions are made, okay? And so the expansion of the ghetto, you can see from the early northern to the classic northern, is in the area immediately surrounding the Central Business District, the downtown area, if you will. Okay, the early southern you can see is areas that would be associated with plantation agriculture, living in houses behind, as it says there, behind the master's house. But then the classic southern is kind of the other side of the tracks, tend to be a more remote area in a rural environment. Okay. And we can still, to a certain extent, see this in certain areas. In this case, from one of our textbooks, the city of Chicago. Right? Looking at, I believe this is going to be, I don't know if this is census tract or this is just block data, but looking at percentage of population by race in the city of Chicago. And we can see the areas that are almost completely white and areas that are almost completely African American. And you can see the city limits of different areas. So we see different cities where almost exclusively black or white. You can see, again, they have the railroad tracks there. So the other side of the tracks mention that we just gave a moment ago. And we can see that to a certain extent, maybe legal segregation doesn't exist anymore, but there is still separation of races and ethnicities, as we're going to point out on the next slide. So we have to understand a couple of different elements, historical elements that go into this. Okay, first part of this is we have to mention the separate but equal doctrine that came about. Okay, and separate but equal led to segregation, and segregation is a measure of the degree to which members of a minority group are not uniformly distributed among the total population. In other words, they're clustered, they're segregated, they're clustered in a particular area. Okay, and the separate but equal doctrine did give rise to segregation as well as Jim Crow laws. So a little bit of background about what the separate but equal doctrine is. In 1896, a case came before the Supreme Court called Plessy v. Ferguson. And a man named Homer Plessy was going into the whites-only railroad car in, I believe it was Louisiana, and was asked to leave, didn't leave. They removed him from the train, challenged it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that it was possible to have separate facilities, in other words, black and white facilities, as long as they are equal. And so that's where the term separate but equal came about. You could have separate facilities, but they had to be equal. Now, fast forwarding a bit into the 1950s, segregation was outlawed during the 1950s and largely began with a Supreme Court case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. And it was during this case that the Supreme Court evaluated the separate but equal doctrine when it came to schools and education. And what the Supreme Court said was that separate is, quote, inherently unequal. That you can't have separate facilities that are equal. They are inherently unequal, was the way that the Supreme Court phrased it. And so segregation was outlawed, but it took a long period of time for this to be enacted. And so it wasn't, there were still many schools that were segregated on into the 1960s. And as integration came about, and integrating schools is desegregating them, bringing them together, integrating them. There wasn't a lot of integration. In fact, during the 1950s, there was rapid suburbanization, the move out to the suburbs. And we'll continue to discuss several of the reasons why, because there's a lot of reasons later on in the school year that we'll get to when we talk about cities and urban land use. But one of the facts that we mentioned here with regards to ethnicity is that most of the people moving out to the suburbs were white. And this was what was the term that was coined for this was white flight. Is that they left these interior urban areas and went out to the suburbs. And there was a practice known as blockbusting that sped that up. And blockbusting was when real estate speculators would come in and go to white families and try and intimidate them and into selling their homes for lower values, with the threat that minorities were going to move into the neighborhood and that the value of their homes would depreciate. And so white families sold their homes at lower than market value, and then those speculators who had just bought the homes for lower than what they were worth actually raised them above market value and sold them to middle-class black families who had previously been unable to move into these almost exclusively white neighborhoods for this above market value cost. And so they used fear to try and intimidate people to sell cheap so that they could turn around and sell it to someone else who had previously been unable to move in there, typically black families, and make a huge profit on it. And that was known as blockbusting. And this practice is largely illegal now. It might be entirely illegal across the country, but I believe it's on the individual state level as to whether or not it's illegal. And this, again, it allowed African Americans to expand out of the ghettos, which was that third move. But it was still largely interior urban areas as those white families went to the suburbs. Right? So again, we're using this as an example, and so we're going to take a look at this in a little bit more detail in class. We'll actually look at a specific city in class and look at some more details. So I'll see you in class to discuss that. Have a good evening, everyone.